Okay, so we have spent a lot of time analyzing the writing of other writers and building in some of the tools that writers use into our own skill sets. Now we're at the point where we're 3.5 weeks out from the exam, and the exam is supposed to measure your proficiency at doing college level reading and writing. So, analysis. So, in actuality, it would be rare that in a college class your writing requirements would be as simple as take this passage, analyze it, and write an essay about it. But the skills that you would use to do that are the skills that you will use in the bigger picture to analyze articles and whatever your discipline is, to write an organized, eloquent interpretation of that material, to engage your reader with a lot of sophistication. So these are the things that we really want to hone at this point. We need to go from the big picture to the more precise picture, which is those are the tools that you will take with you into life beyond AP Lang and put them to good use towards your academic success in college and graduate school, wherever you end up after this. Okay, so we're going to write this essay. This is an essay. It's one of their sample prompts in AP Classroom. It's about a passage by an American journalist and politician named Clare Boothe Luce. So, how do we approach this? Sometimes what I see in your essays is that we skip right over the part of referencing the prompt. So, this is the prompt for the essay. Now, occasionally, not always, but occasionally, some of you jump right into your response without giving it the context that it needs. So, remember, we're looking for the rhetorical situation. Who's the subject? What's the purpose? Who's the audience? What's the context? What's the exigence? Those things, lots of times on the AP exam, are laid out in the directions to the prompt, if not in the passage themselves. So, even as you're doing this exam on the computer, I think I read that it will be an option for you to print out the prompt. If you have the capacity to do that, I think it would probably be a good idea so that you can then mark it up. You'll probably be able to annotate it on the computer too. But I would rather do everything on paper, personally. Okay, so here's how I would think through this. The passage below is the opening to a speech in 1960. Time frame often is important. 1960 by American journalist and politician. So she's got dual roles, journalist and politician, which might give her differing perspectives on this, or maybe we want to find a way to connect it. So, or maybe she finds a way to connect it, I mean. So these are all things about the context and about the speaker, beyond just her name, Clare Boothe Luce. So, who's the audience? She's speaking to journalists at the Women's National Press Club. So this would be an organization of women reporters. In this speech, Luce went on to criticize the tendency of the American press to sacrifice journalistic integrity, that seems pretty powerful, in favor of the perceived public demand for sensationalist stories. This is obviously still an issue in the media. So, integrity versus sensationalism. Read the passage carefully, then in a well-developed essay, analyze how Luce uses the introduction to prepare the audience for her message. So how does she prime the audience for what she's going to say based on the introduction that she gives here? So we're looking at purpose. We're looking at exigence. Right? So the exigence would be that she sees a problem here with journalistic integrity being sacrificed for sensationalist stories. There's a saying in the news business, if it bleeds, it leads. Stories about blood and gore often get more attention. Stories about things that are sensationalized get more attention. That speaks to the idea of sacrificing journalistic integrity in favor of perceived public demand. Perceived is important. Right? So I'm looking for words that are important in this passage, in the directions. If it's a perceived public demand, it might not be. It's just how I take in that the public is receiving my information. The public actually needs real news, maybe not sensationalized stories. So I might talk about how it's just a perceived public demand when in actuality, what the public needs is news. Okay, so support your analysis of her rhetoric. Now, this will be the stable language of the prompt. Support, which means it's the language they use over and over again. Support your analysis of her rhetoric with specific references to the text. Specific references to the text is how they tell you to use quotes. Okay. You can also paraphrase things and refer to the text in other ways, but the most specific way to reference the text is by quoting it. So make sure that you use little slivers of text in your analysis. We know that. We're pretty good at that. One of the things that I go back to, though, a lot in people's essays, analyze how she uses the introduction. There's a big difference between explaining how something is used and just saying that it is used. Right? I can tell you that the Americans defeated the British at Lexington and Concord. I can tell you that, or I can explain how you did it, which goes into much more depth and detail and the mechanics of something that happened. So we want to explain how something is used and not just say that it's used. This is where we get our points for commentary and evidence, explaining how she uses the introduction to prepare the audience. Okay, so what they're not going to do in the prompt is tell you specific things to talk about. They're not going to say, like some of the examples that we looked at, that the way that the essays were set up in the past, it would say, explain how the writer uses the resources of language. You might consider discussing tone, hyperbole, and figurative tropes. They're not going to give you those suggestions because they don't want to box you in. They don't want you to feel like you have to talk about the things that they suggest. So you are going to have to come up with a couple of things in your analysis. Right? This is where we get into the choices. What choices does the author make in the introduction that will prepare the audience for her message? So you're going to have to come up with the things to talk about. And remember, I know I keep saying this, I'm going to say it again. You can identify specific rhetorical devices. You can talk about the syntax. You can, but if you don't know the name for something, you can just describe what it is that the writer does. So if you know that the writer is using synecdoche, substituting a part of something for the whole of it, that's a figurative trope. But you don't remember the name synecdoche, or you're afraid you're going to spell it wrong. If you remember the name and you're afraid you're going to spell it wrong, I would spell it however you can spell it. But if you don't remember the name, you can describe it. In this passage, the author substitutes the word wheels for car. And here's the impact that has. It emphasizes the motion because the wheels are the part of a car that moves. So you want to take a couple of minutes in the beginning of writing your essay to really kind of flesh out your understanding of the prompt and what it's asking you to do. Okay, who's the speaker? Clare Boothe Luce. She's a woman, she's a journalist, she's a politician. Who her purpose is to address this problem of journalists foregoing their integrity in order to give what they think the public wants, which is sensationalized news. The audience is an audience of her fellow journalists. So how might she talk to them differently than she might talk to a more general audience? What's the context? It's the 1960s. It's the early 1960s. We might find out in the passage why that's important, but this is before, this is early in the civil rights movement. This is a time period where women were not necessarily in the forefront of journalism, and how might that play into it? So you want to think out why the details might be important. You don't want to just read it and go on to the essay. The more context you can build in, like I can build my whole introduction of my essay around this rhetorical situation. And the exigence is then that she has identified that journalism is becoming too sensationalized, and that sort of violates journalistic integrity. So how is she what you're going to read is just the introduction to her speech, how she sets up the audience to be ready to process what she's going to say in your speech. I think I know in a time context you're afraid to spend too much time. Obviously, I wouldn't spend this much time marking it up because you're not going to have a whole conversation with somebody about the prompt. But you really want to think it through, identify what it's asking you to do, analyze how she uses the introduction. That's important, how she uses the introduction. So it's not asking you to write about, summarize what she talks about in the introduction. Analyze how she uses the introduction to prepare the audience. The audience being an audience full of women journalists in 1960. And then what in my analysis, remember when analyze means to break something into its parts and look at the relationship between the parts. So in my analysis, what things do I see her doing? And then how do those things help to prepare her audience for her subject? Even on the exam day, I would spend 2, 3, 4 minutes doing this and then identifying the choices that she makes in the introduction, which is really all you get is the introduction. Analyze the choices that she makes and the impact of those choices. So what does the writer do? And how does that connect? How does that help convey her meaning? What does she do? How will it not let me write on there? Okay. How does that impact or contribute? Contribute might be a better word. Contribute to her purpose. This is what you want to keep going back to. And that's what you also want to consider in your own writing. What am I doing as a writer, and how is that helping me move my purpose forward? That's really the important part of all of this stuff that we've been doing. You being able to do that in your own writing. Okay, so what does the writer do? Ooh. Made it D instead of an H. What does she do? And how does that impact her purpose? And her purpose is to prepare the audience for her message. Okay, so even if you take more time than that, when you sit down to do this, although at this point it's really important for you to practice within the time frame, because when you have your take-home exam or your at-home exam, once the time is up, once the 45 minutes are up, you're not going to be able to submit the essay. So okay, so I'm going to give you the prompt separately so that you can mark up the prompt, even though I just marked it up for you. You might have, I would identify what the choices are in my marking up of the prompt. You'll have the passage too, obviously. Before you start writing, but the whole process you have to finish within 45 minutes. Okay, so when you go into AP Classroom, you will see that the timer will start. Obviously, don't panic, but you want to have the prep and the writing done in 45 minutes. Okay, be safe.